Forward. Okay, everybody, welcome to the fourth and final part of the holiday history course. We're now going to talk about Yom Kippur. If you have a machzor, please keep it, a Yom Kippur machzor, keep it handy, and we will begin. So, we spoke about the different eras of the Gaonim, which is approximately 600 to 1000, and already in that era, which is post-Talmud, the rabbis basically the next 500 years after the Talmud closed, and we already find reference to the Kol Nidre. So if you have the machzor, please go to page page 36, Kol Nidre, the most famous of probably all the high holiday prayers. And it's not really a prayer if you look at it. If you read it, it says all vows, prohibitions, oaths, consecrations, restrictions, interdictions, or any other equivalent expressions of vows, which I may vow, swear, dedicate, which I may prescribe for myself or for others from this Yom Kippur until the next Yom Kippur, which comes to us for good. We regret them all shall be hereby absolved, remitted, canceled, declared null and void, not in force or in effect. Let our vows not be considered vows. Let our self-imposed prohibitions not be considered prohibitions. Let our oaths not be considered oaths. So it sounds like you're just basically cleaning and erasing all your promises, or any promise you did, you're taking back. So this is a very controversial prayer, believe it or not. And the Torah, because first of all, the Torah takes keeping one's word very, very seriously. And the vows we're talking about here, just to be clear, are the vows between man and God. The vows one takes between man and their fellow man, that is still binding. You can't just say, I take it back. But as you can imagine, there was a lot of fear on the rabbi's part, saying that people might just say this takes, what's like the absolving an oath? It's saying that, look, I promised I'm going to do this pious act, but I couldn't do it. It just wasn't bearable. So I take it. I'm annulling it. People might. The worry was people might take this to the next step, which is, oh, I don't have to keep any of my words. I just, I can say a promise and then take it away, or it might be seen like that. Or maybe the non-Jews, a lot of times the non-Jews even knew about it, and they said the Jews aren't trustworthy, even though it's not talking about vows between man and man. It's between man and God. That's what made it kind of controversial. The era of the Geonim, which we talked about, which is 600 to 1000, post-Talmud, they talk about, and most of them were actually in opposition to saying the Kol Nidre, if you can imagine that. The Rabbi Amram Gaon, he said it's a foolish custom. However, as you know, in halacha, it's a discussion, and the reality is the custom survived, and to this day we do say it, albeit that there were some changes of the formulation of the words. But the question is, this is possibly the most famous prayer, and why is the question. And the question is, why would this be? It's kind of like a very technical thing of, relinquishing one's religious extra vows. This is a prayer. This is the most famous prayer. So why do you think it became so famous? So there are a lot of theories. One of the theories of why Kol Nidre rose to the top of the charts is because of the era we spoke about in the 7th century, when the Jews that lived in the Spanish territories were under the Visigoths, 7th century, and they were forced. This is pre, Isabella and Ferdinand in 1492 expelling the Spanish Jews. But earlier, when it was ruled by the Visigoths, they forbade Jewish practice on pain of death, and a lot of the Jews did this pretend thing. So, as you know, many Jews, this is even pre the Marranos, this is 700 years earlier, but already back then there were many Jews that were pretending to be Christians outwardly, and while in secret they would worship. They would do Jewish practice, and they would converge on Yom Kippur. And there's one theory that maybe the Kol Nidre became famous because it said anything that we promised to our Christian overlords, we are annulling. This was under duress. Okay, that's one theory. Another theory. Some speculate that the introductory phrase permitting the congregation to pray with avaryonim, it refers to the Iberians, meaning, it's some actually that the first theory of that it was under the Visigoths that this became a very dear prayer, because it was kind of like telling God, don't believe what I am acting outwardly, believe what's in my heart as a Jew. Some say you see this in the words, Kol Nidre V'Yasarei B'Charamei. We talk about the Avaryonim. We talk about the introductory that so I guess some versions have that I forget where it's not actually in this version of Kol Nidre, but I'm sorry, it's in page 35 in the Machzor. With the sanction of the omnipresent and with the sanction of the congregation, we hereby grant permission to pray with those who have transgressed. In Hebrew, those who have transgressed means avaryonim. Avaryonim mean the transgressors, but also it's a play on words, the Iberians, those that live in the Iberian Peninsula, which is today's Spain and Portugal, when again the 7th century Visigoths were coercing them to pay lip service to Christianity. Okay, so that's one theory, very nice theory. Another idea is that the custom originated elsewhere, and it could be though that although it didn't necessarily start in those dark times, maybe it became more potent and poignant due to the situation, and especially the second wave of conversos in 1492, when so many Jews pretended to be Christian, that in the bestsellers, when they kept Yom Kippur, maybe that's where it became more prominent and more dear to the fame of being the most well-known Yom Kippur prayer. We see in the 11th century, we find the practice of beginning its chant in a soft voice and increasing its volume with each repetition, because we say it 3 times and we go higher and higher. We also find reference to a melody, probably not the melody we're used to today, but you can imagine that whatever the melody was, it's a very, very striking time. The sun is setting, it's the holiest day of the year, the Torah scrolls are out, and beginning the 25 hours of Yom Kippur, and so on. Now, beneath the legalistic understanding of it, of relinquishing our religious vows. There's a poem, Max Arst wrote, giving, I guess, a poem about the Kol Nidre. In this moment of solemnity, we enter an atmosphere charged with the highest sanctity. Happy are we, the cleansing of our souls comes from God. Before him we lay bare our secret selves and reflect on how our life is beset by the dilemma of high promise and great expectation shot on the reef of waywardness. Kol Nidre. All our vows spoken with good faith, forgotten. Kol Nidre. All our resolves fashioned with eager determination, forgotten. Kol Nidre. All our goals conceived with honorable intent, forgotten. Because of our inconstancy of our will, our achievement is often too small. Forgive us for having failed thee and for edifying our desire to serve thee with deeper conviction and greater consistency. Forgive the entire congregation of Israel and the stranger who dwells in its midst, for our sin is not one of design, but of human weakness. Okay. That's the general gist, and it's very, very, again, while it's about the vows each individual took upon themselves, in addition, it's also the idea of we're telling all the things that I told myself that I couldn't, that I said I would want to do and I couldn't understand. It was my human fallibility, but not my real desire to rebel or not to do. Okay, let's talk about, we talked briefly in the past classes about the famous family of Ashkenaz. Many say most of Ashkenaz originated with this family, or a few families, and they were like the leaders. By the last name Kalanimus, which is a Greek term for good name, Shem Tov. And we mentioned was Yekusiel of the Yekusiel Kalanimus, son of Moshe, son of Kalanimus the first one. This is and he wrote the repetition, the extra parts we say of Rosh Hashanah, the first day Shachris. So that was the first guy. Kalanimus wrote the beginning of the Shachris editions. But his grandson lived in Speyer in Germany, but the family had originally come from Italy. The grandfather, Kalanimus, was the son of Meshulam, the Great of Rome, whose Kerov we were studying Yom Kippur. As we have seen, the Jews of Spain were in close connection with the Babylonian Gaonim. Thus, the Babylonian customs became the customs we know as Sephardic. Interesting. So, Sephardic and Ashkenaz is a later development in history, when they were dispersed after the destruction of the first temple, and even more so in the second temple. But the real centers till the 1000, at least of the Common Era, was Babylon. And that's actually the source of the customs we know as Sephardic. Because the Sephardic Jews, which were kind of more pioneering, they left the hub of Jewish life in Babylon, they were in contact with the Babylonian academies and asked for direction, and they got it. And they followed the Sephardim were really keeping Babylonian custom. The Jews of Italy had a stronger link with the communities in the Holy Land. As one of the founding families of Ashkenaz, the Kalanimus family, they actually brought the customs of Israel, of the land of Israel. They brought that to France and Germany, making those customs Ashkenaz. So when we say Ashkenaz and Sfard, really it's those places got them from correspondence or from other originator areas, which is Ashkenaz was from the ancient land of Israel customs, and Sfard was Babylon. Okay, if you have the Machzor, we're going to turn to page 156. So the structure of many of the editions, the hymns, this instruction for many of the hymns are Rishus. The Chazan asks permission to lead the congregation. So go to page 156 in the Chabad Kahas Machzor. We see a Mecha Nasati. I'm awe-stricken as I offer supplication. The cantor saying this awe-stricken task of leading everybody in prayer. The person Misoid, so if you look, we see something that actually Imatzta Aser, you've established, this is on page 157, you've established the 10th day of Tishrei. This is by Reb Meshulam of Rome. I'm sorry, so the Kalanimus original guy, the founder of Ashkenaz Jewry, his father was the great Meshulam, the Great of Rome. And that's Imatzta Asor, followed by his mostly admitted Mechaya, okay. Then we're going to see Imatzta. If you look at Imatzta, which is, again, if you don't have a Machzor, it's hard to show this. But it's an alphabetic acrostic. It's a rhyming, actually. It's very interesting. And it discusses the day as one designated for atonement, Eli, Eli. Yeah. Okay, moving along. Okay. As it continues, tip, let's see the tip the scales of righteousness, chai chai, extol you and jubilate, young and ancient. In Moreh Chataim 160 to 163, we actually see the acrostic of the first letter of every line of each paragraph. It hints, it's the code of the name, Meshulam Biribi, which means the son of the great rabbi, Kalanimus. It's interesting to note that. It talks about you instruct the sinners in the path in which you walk. You teach me the way to go, which I should go. Then on page...
So, Rabbi, I take it that this isn't it, what you're talking about isn't in the materials that you sent me.
No, the past...
Understood.
Yeah.
Yeah. I understood. I understand.
Page
Thanks.
160. I don't have it a PDF to put it on the board.
Yeah. I know. I got it. Thanks.
Okay. Page 164 talks about extolling God, how God is slow to, well, it bases itself on the psalmist's call, extol the Lord, how awesome are your deeds. The theme is of power, of grandeur, of might, and of tenderness. His splendor covers heaven, and he spreads earth over waters. He thunders from the heavens, gives voice to the celestial sea. Let him be glorified. His throne, the radiance of his throne of fire, his attendants are blazing fire, brilliant fire, flashing fire. But then we see, so it talks about God being so unapproachable. Then, though, it ends off how God is so tender. He dwells on high, but is with the low. His kindness is eternal. He hears the destitute, gives ear to supplication. Let him be glorified. On one hand, it talks about God's greatness. On the other hand, it talks about human frailty and our need for forgiveness. Page 168, it points to a paradox. Maisa Eloheinu, the work of our God. The Almighty has innumerable angels, but God doesn't want the angels. He wants the fallible human being to serve him. And that is God's glory. In Musaf, we find this is skipping ahead. In Musaf, we find a similar theme, an even more evocative hymn by the same author called Asher Emasecha. And in Musaf, we find the Avodah. The one in our Machzor is Ata Kainanta Olam Mirosh. You acquired the world from days of yore, from the very beginning. We don't know, the author is anonymous. Let's resume our story. Okay. So we took a little break to talk about some of the Yom Kippur prayers. Now we're going back to history. There's an ancient tradition that on the very day that Rabbi Akiva, the great Rabbi Akiva, died, the luminary by the name of Rebbe was born. A much later tradition marks the passing of Rabbeinu Gershom. Rabbeinu Gershom was the leader of diaspora Jewry, and he died in 1040 of the Common Era. And there's a tradition that the day of his passing was the day that Rashi was born, the great teacher, Rabbi Shlomo Yitzchaki, who is the commentary on the Talmud and the Chumash that's the most fundamental. And you see that, when the sun sets, the sun rises. Now, in Rashi's case, we've spoken many times. We cannot overstate his impact on the study of Torah, his unique gift of making the Torah accessible, at the same time, having it very, very profound for the seasoned scholar, and both it resonated with both. Okay. So Rashi was born in 1040, and the young age, in probably late teens, early 20s, he became famous, and okay. Many of Rashi's disciples was from his own family. And they transformed the study of Talmud with their own commentaries called the Tosfos, one of Rashi's students, this is relevant to the liturgy, was a man by the name of Simcha, Rabbi Simcha, who came from the town of Vitry. He put together a machzor known as Machzor Vitry, which is basically where this student recorded many of Rashi's teachings and practices, as well as collecting the prayers and liturgical practices, which is probably the most oft-cited of one of the earliest liturgical high holiday books, this Machzor Vitry. Okay, in the year 1055, the Abbasid Caliphate, we spoke about that when Muhammad died, eventually there was a fight between two groups, and the one that won out was the Abbasids, and they had a caliphate, but they, and I don't know how to pronounce this, so excuse me, they eventually got dominated by a Turkish clan known as the Seljuks, or Seljuks, the Seljuks. Ostensibly, the caliphs, basically, they let them have the throne, but the Seljuks were really in charge. They were the military leaders, and they called themselves sultans. Over time, what happened? The sultan became the Arab ruler's term, and the caliph was really the religious, cleric authority. Now, in the 11th century, the Seljuk Turks, who again are dominating the caliphate, the Muslim caliphate, they expanded their territories into Anatolia, which is today's Turkey, and that already started threatening the Byzantine Empire. The Seljuks' victory at the Battle of Manzikert in 1071 alarmed the Byzantine Emperor Alexios I Komnenos so much that he turned to the West for help. In 1095, Pope Urban II issued a passionate call to arms, urging Christians to embark on a holy war to reclaim Jerusalem from the Seljuks. I'm probably butchering the name, but that's the way it looks to me. In response, this is what started the Crusades. Initially, a diverse group of commoners and peasants, known as the People's Crusade, set out for Jerusalem in 1096 before crusading armies had even assembled. Led by eccentric figures like Peter the Hermit, the hastily assembled group was undisciplined and ill-equipped. I'm going to just pull up in the handout for those that don't know. One moment. Here we go. Okay. Share screen. So first of all, this was in your handout. Kol Nidre, in the 18th century Machzor, a 16th century depiction of Rashi, probably not accurate, but whatever. The Rashi Synagogue in Worms, Germany. It was eventually destroyed and rebuilt. Here we go. We have an image of Peter the Hermit, the one element of the People's Crusades. Interesting, it seems that he didn't perpetrate the atrocities that we are going to talk about. He extorted money but didn't attack them. Okay, let's talk, we'll keep it's on the board. So you have here in the red, the Byzantine Empire and the Seljuk Sultanate of Rome. So now the goal of the Crusaders was Jerusalem and the infidels, the Muslims who controlled it. But on the way, they said, we have all these local infidels, Jews, don't accept Christianity. So here's some horrible atrocities. In the spring of 1096, 22 Jews were slain at Metz. And on May 3rd, the Crusaders and accompanying rabble attacked the Jews of Speyer, slaying 11 of them, and only being restrained by the exertions of Bishop John for putting them all to death. On May 18th, the Jews of Worms were all slain except a few who were forcibly baptized or who took refuge with the bishop. Their houses were destroyed, even the corpses denuded. Many slew themselves rather than fall in hands to the mob. The bishop's palace was stormed a week later, and all those within were put to death. One of the richest Jewesses, named Minna, she implored some of her friends among the nobles to accept. She was surrounded by the mob, and some of her friends amongst the nobles begged her to accept baptism, but she resolutely refused and was put to death. Several were drowned, and Mar Shamaria, which was one of the leaders, with his whole family, is buried alive amid the jeer of the mobs, and who nevertheless, during the entombment, offered the Jews to give them safety if they would become converted. On the same day, Count Amico arrived at Mayence with a numerous band of crusaders, but he was not admitted by the court, the Archbishop Ruthard, who promised protection to the Jews. 2 days later, this count forced submission through a side gate, and notwithstanding the armed defense of the Jews, succeeded in destroying them all except Kalonimus, the president of the congregation, and 53 others who hid themselves in the treasure house of the cathedral. A number of Jews who had defended themselves all day in a fortified position found it untenable as night came by, and they killed themselves. The number was said to have been 1,014 people that day. Mar Isaac ben David, after having submitted to baptism, burned down his own house and the synagogue and perished in the flames because it was rumored that Christians intended to turn the synagogue into a church. The 53 people who were saved, they were taken in boats to Rudesheim, and they were kept there, but on June 1st, the bishop said he can't protect them unless they baptized, submitted to baptism. They killed themselves rather than do this, and Kalonimus put his own son Joseph to death, and then, wild with grief, attempted to kill the archbishop, but was prevented and killed. Crusaders attacked the house and the synagogue of the Jews of Cologne on May 30th, but here the citizens protected the Jews in their own house until Archbishop to 7 neighboring villages. The Crusaders followed them to these places, killing 200 in Neus and Altenar. In many cases, throwing old women and children to the river. In Altenar, the Jews slew themselves, and you see a lot of times they'd rather kill themselves than fall into the hands and be forced to baptize. Now, this People's Crusade, they themselves were almost entirely wiped out, and they reached Asia Minor, but didn't bring back the dead Jews back to life. Okay. When a real army was composed and set off to what we call the First Crusade, they did not engage in the kind of atrocities that the People's Crusade had, but they reserved their massacres for later. When they reached Jerusalem on July 15th, 1099, they drove all the Jews into one of the synagogues and burned them alive. So pre-1096, pre-Crusader, the Jews didn't have it easy in Europe, but there was, the restrictions and expulsions, but the widespread legal restrictions and the rate of expulsions and suppressions really were exacerbated and began in the wake of the Crusades. So what is this relevant to the Machzor? Because this trauma that was burned into our psyche is where many composed hymns, piyutim, about that. For example, the of Harachamim, we say this action Shabbos before Musaf, and we talk about these. We talk about the God within His profound compassion. Remember with mercy the pious, the upright, the perfect ones, holy communities who gave their lives in sanctification of Thy name, sweet and beloved in their lifetimes, in death they are not departed. Okay. Rashi was born, this is the middle of Rashi's, the end of Rashi's life. So we talked before, Rashi, with his commentary, opened up the Talmud and the Chumash and the Tanakh to anybody that can read basic Hebrew in a very simple commentary. But now what it did was it showed that sometimes there seems to be contradictions at different places in the Torah or in passages of the Talmud. So his grandchildren, the Tosafot, they did a lot of times of comparison of contradictory statements and trying to reconcile them. So one Talmudic narrative was about Simon the Just being escorted into the Holy of Holies. We talked about him. Shimon HaTzadik, who was the high priest in the times of Alexander the Great. And it states there, no person shall be in the tent of meeting, in the Holy of Holies. Or no one should be in the tent of meeting when the high priest goes to the Holy of Holies on Yom Kippur. So it says, on one hand, but wait a second. It implies, but angels could be there. But we know from a prior tradition, even angels, no one could be there. So the Yerushalmi says, perhaps it was the divine presence. Among the many stars that came forth from Rashi was Rabbi Yaakov Tam, Rabbeinu Tam. One addition that he added was regarding the text of Kol Nidre, so he changed it. In his time, which is probably like late, 1000s, early 1100s, there was an issue they had about you can't retroactively if you violated a vow, so if you annul it now, it doesn't help for the vow you violated. So it used to be Kol Nidre was all the oaths that I took that I didn't do should be considered annulled, but that doesn't seem to be possible. So he amended it and said that in Kol Nidre we're annulling the vows that we will make and can't keep in the year to come. Okay, so the Crusader kingdom. As we have here. It was established in 1099. It didn't last very long. Roughly every half century, for the next few centuries, new crusades were launched. None saw the success of the first. In 1187, Muslim forces under Saladin retook Jerusalem, shrinking Crusader controls the coastal areas. So this is that map here. Kingdom of Jerusalem. They had it in 1135. 1187, the Muslims took it back. In response, the Third Crusade was launched. While attacks on Jews did not take place nearly as much as they had in 1096, there was some terrible carnage. England's King Richard the Lionhearted was fairly tolerant to his Jewish subjects, but unfortunately that did not stop the wholesale destruction of the community at York. When I was studying in London, I went to York. I saw this. The community's leader, his name was Yossi Jassi of York. He was very respected. He actually was by Richard. He was invited to Richard's coronation. This rabbi of the town was Rabbi Yom Tov, a disciple of the famous Rabbeinu Tam, Rashi's grandson, had come from France and was renowned for his piety and scholarship. So he composed the Piyut Yom Kippur's Arvit Silichot. It's built around the biblical Salachti, I have pardoned. In Hebrew, it's just one word. It doesn't say the page. I'm trying to see where. Where is that? I'm not sure where he's quoting from. Okay. On May 17th, 1190, the mob approached York. So that prayer, which I don't have which page it's on, but the rabbi created that prayer, which we use. And 1190, the mob approached. York's constable gave the community refuge in Clifford's Castle, which I visited. The castle can be visited today with a plaque memorializing what happened next. With the mob about to overwhelm the defenses and forcibly convert them, Rabbi Yom Tov, Yassi, and 150 souls took their own lives rather than submit to the crusaders. Okay, Spain. Rabbeinu Hai Gaon in Babylonia and Rabbeinu Gershom, we spoke of them earlier, but in North Africa arose a new star. His name was Rabbeinu Yitzchak of Fez, which was called Alfasi, Yitzchak Alfasi, who was known as the Rif. He did a very interesting thing. He followed the pages of the Talmud, but he wrote the sort of the halachic takeaways of each. He didn't reorder it like Maimonides, but he made like a takeaway accompanying guide to the Talmud so you can see the laws taken away from each page. And a lot of his work became the basis for the later works of Maimonides and so on. It's very interesting. His authority was so great. He was so world renowned as such a rabbi, a scholar, that we spoke this year. We didn't blow the shofar on Rosh Hashanah because of the decree that you don't blow the shofar on Shabbat, on the first day, when it falls on Rosh Hashanah. But in Jerusalem, the times of the temple, they would blow it in the temple. So his court was so well renowned, they blew the shofar on Shabbat because they're almost like temple era level. And later in life, this Rabbeinu Yitzchak Alfasi, the Rif, as he's known, moved to Spain and headed the yeshiva in Lucena. Among his pupils was the two famous rabbis, Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, the poet and author of the famous philosophical classic, the Kuzari, as well as Rabbeinu Yosef Ibn Migash, who was the teacher of the Rambam. The son, the Rambam, was Moshe, the son of Maimon. And so he lived in Cordoba, which was Spain's golden age, where it was drawing to an end. The famed Cordoba Caliphate were fighting with each other and squabbling as they tried to fight the Christians from the north. And eventually they reconquered the country from the Christian forces in the north. It was called the Reconquista. But it took 450 years. It wasn't like a successful one-year battle. And what happened was, since they were so fighting amongst each other, they actually fell prey to a new fundamentalist strain of Islam called the Almohads, who basically, they didn't allow any infidels to live in myths. They say either you convert or you get expelled. And Rambam, we spoke about that, but Rambam's Yartzeit, we showed the movie. Rambam's family, they fled. Eventually, they went to North Africa, and then they went to Israel, and they went to North Africa, to Egypt. The Rambam, we spoke many times, created the first comprehensive codifying of Jewish law. Okay, In the 13th century, this is very important, a Spanish rabbi named Moshe de Leon, he publicized a work that quoted the legendary Talmudic scholar Shimon Bar Yochai. This is a famous book called the Sefer HaZohar, the first book of the famous book of Kabbalah. Okay. Just skipping ahead. Okay, in the realm of Jewish law, these centuries, Kabbalah, made prayer a lot more mystical, a lot more, mystical intentions and whatnot. But we're not going to get into that. In the realm of Jewish law, these centuries, 1200s, they saw the famous rabbis and commentators and codifiers, the Rabbeinu Meir, Rabbi Meir of Rothenburg, who actually was taken hostage by King Rudolph I when he tried leaving Germany, and his rabbinic position in Worms was taken up by his disciple, the Rosh, Rabbeinu Asher, son of Yechiel. He too was persecuted, and he fled Germany to Toledo, home of the famous Rabbi Shlomo ben Aderes. The Rosh was very important. He also made a distillation in every page of the Talmud of the final ruling of the law. So he actually wrote about post-Talmudic liturgy. Moving on. The Rosh distilled the Talmud into practical halacha. He would help choose sides when there's debates and saying what's the final law. And the difference was him versus the Rambam. He followed the Ashkenazic tradition. The Rambam followed the Sephardic. Somewhere around now was a book called the Kolbo. Kolbo means all, like all is within it. A collection of Jewish law rulings. The authorship is uncertain. That book contains interesting idea. It has an interesting idea that the three Uvachain stanzas, the three stanzas of sovereignty, remembrance, and shofar, he finds how to link it. How? The Lord's sovereignty is the subject of Uvachain tein pachtecha. Uvachain tein kavod la'amecha is a request for us to remember us. Uvachain tzadikim is a messianic plea, which is referring to the shofar. Moving along, we talked in Rosh Hashanah, there's a trifold theme of sovereignty, remembrance of our merits, of our forefather ancestors' merits, and about the shofar. So he says that's also embedded within the Yom Kippur liturgy, although it's not as explicit. The Black Death. In the 1340s and 50s, over a third of Europe's population was wiped out by bubonic plague. Entire towns and regions were left barren. It would be a century before the continent recovered. So Jewish communities in Europe had it doubly bad. A, they had the plague. B, they were persecuted by their neighbors as being the ones to commit the plague. It's the witchcraft of the Jews, the poisoning of the wells of the Jews. And there's a lot of massacres against Jews. Pope Clement VI spoke against the pogroms. He says ridiculous to say the Jews are to blame, but it didn't really work, especially the Emperor Charles the fourth of the Holy Roman Empire. We spoke about him last week. He actually gave a financial incentive to the mobs to by making the property of its victims forfeit. 510 communities were destroyed. It's crazy. That led to the Jews migrating to the east, to the Kingdom of Poland. This is where Yizkor actually goes back to the Medrash. We're accustomed to mention the dead. And some say, and the Yizkor, the first Yizkor was composed, when we say today, it actually was composed in memory of the martyrs during the Crusades or during the Black Death. In 1492, a new diaspora happened where Spanish families spread to Europe that wasn't controlled by Spain and even to the Ottoman Empire. 16th century, we talk about Tzfas becoming a very important city, Sefed, Tzfat. Rabbi Yosef Karo, he wrote the book called the Shulchan Aruch. There's also a lot of mysticism there, the Arizal, Rabbi Isaac Luria, and others. So Rabbi Yosef Karo, who eventually authored the Code of Jewish Law, he was 4 years old in Toledo when his family was expelled with the rest of Spain's Jews, 1492. He lived in various places in the Ottoman Empire before settling in the Galilee and Tzfat. He wrote three masterpiece works. The Kesef Mishnah, a commentary on Maimonides' code. The second was a commentary on another code, called the Beit Yosef, and the main one is the Shulchan Aruch, an index. Okay. Because the Kabbalists, this Tzfas, a lot of the Kabbalists introduced a lot of prayers or psalms to be said and deeper meaning. So prayer took on a whole new central role in the mid-1500s in Tzfat. So as we look back in history and try to compress, so we spoke about a lot of history being crammed into four classes. We could see like romanticizing good times or seeing bleak, times. It's never true because there were times where it was really bad, but also there was a lot of light even in the Dark Ages. The Jews really, kept their religion and flourished with scholarship, even in the worst of times. Poland, in the 16th century, 7th century, there was the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, and today Poland's not so big. Back in the day, it was huge. Its territories included parts of in the 16th, 7th centuries included parts of Russia, Poland, Lithuania, Ukraine, Belarus, Latvia, Estonia, Moldova. And the communities were represented by the Council of Four Lands. One member was known as Rabbi Isaiah Horowitz, who had a work that basically spread Kabbalah to much of Eastern Europe. Okay, so this ends the history crash course about prayer and the development of certain prayers of the Machzor. Hope you enjoyed it. Let's see a couple more pictures. Clifford's Tower, this is of York. I can say I was there. Maimonides monument in Cordoba, and a 19th century painting of Yosef Karo. I don't know how accurate it is, but gives you a little bit of a feeling. This is the Ariz synagogue in Tzfat. Okay. That ends the class. Thank you all for joining, and have a wonderful Yom Kippur.
Thanks, Rabbi.
You well, Gary. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.